Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final postgraduate symposium for the year 2022. Almost said 2023 because it feels like we're already there. Thank you all for supporting this initiative, being present. I understand that we do have some people who could not make it because of load shedding, which is unfortunate, but they'll be looking at the YouTube videos. I am very pleased that we have that we get a chance to end our symposium by having a great guest. This is Dr. Danelle Fourie. She received her PhD. It was focused on socio-economic inequality, where she explored the work of Amartya Sen and Herbert Marcuse. She's published in this field as well. We actually have a co-authored publication coming out looking at neoliberalism and democracy and the flattening of choice, and how sometimes in certain adversarial style democracies, there appears to be no choice at all between the candidates voting for the same policies in this sense. And she's also a lecturer in, I want to say the marketing department? Marketing management, teaching business ethics. So as you can imagine, she has a great amount of patience because all of her students and all of her colleagues want to talk about stats, and she wants to talk about morality, ethics, and how we can create a greater socioeconomic system and eliminate inequalities, but everybody else is worried about standard deviations. So I think that it's a thrill for her to be with us. She's also lectured at St. Augustine as well. I believe this year you taught which course?
Also ethics.
Also
info.
Yeah, for the info. So I will hand over the mic to you, Danelle. Please feel free to share your screen. If you have a PowerPoint presentation. If you feel comfortable, keep your camera on. If you'd rather not, take it off, doesn't matter. But thank you so much for being here. And afterward, one of Jakob Kruger's PhD students, Jonathan Smith, he will be joining us, I believe, from Argentina. And unfortunately, he's a high school teacher. So, and they're, I think, 7 hours, maybe 6 hours behind. So he's joining us just after he finishes teaching his classes. So we're looking forward to that. That'll be the rounding out of our postgraduate or doctoral symposia for the year. Okay, Danelle, please go right ahead.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today and for giving me the opportunity to present at St. Augustine's College. I really look forward to hearing your comments and your questions, and I hope to live up to your expectations for today. I'm going to switch off my camera and share my screen, and then we can start. Okay. You should be seeing the PowerPoint presentation now. I'm correct. So today I'm going to talk about Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance and what it can add to the conversation about inequality in South Africa. So first of all, there's my email address if you'd like to send me any questions or have any additional comments after the session. So first of all, I thought it would be a great idea to introduce you to the idea of critical theory. So what is critical theory? Critical theory is a school of thought within philosophy and social theory that focuses on developing a critique of society and culture to reveal and challenge power structures. They specifically focus on critiquing the Western or advanced capitalist society, such as America and so on. But because capitalism has become so prevalent within the world, we can see some of their critique being relevant even in countries like South Africa. They do this by using Marxist theory and psychoanalysis. It developed in the 1930s in Germany. Most early critical theorists were members of the Frankfurt School, which is the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt. And many of the early members of the Frankfurt School were forced into exile from Nazi Germany and so settled in the United States. So once they settled in the United States, the members decided to recontextualize the Frankfurt School and called it the critical theory of society. So Herbert Marcuse is one of the early members of the Frankfurt School, and he has defined critical theory as a concern for human happiness and a conviction that it can be attained only through a transformation of the material condition of existence. And he also shows a great concern with the potentialities of man and with the individual's freedom, happiness, and rights. The demand that through the abolition of previous existing material conditions of existence, the totality of human relations can be liberated. So we can see in Marcuse's definition of critical theory that he is very concerned with human happiness, human potentials in the form of human freedom, happiness, and rights, and that this is a very practical type of theory and not necessarily very theoretical, although the theory should support the practical implicalities and critiques of society. So who is Herbert Marcuse? Like I said, he is one of the first members of the Frankfurt School and the critical theory that was moved into the New School in New York. He was an extremely influential philosopher and social theorist who is commonly known as the father of the New Left movement in America and in Europe. His most popular book, One-Dimensional Man, was used as an inspiration for the student protest movements against the Vietnam War in the US and other European countries during the 1960s and 70s. So, some background on Marcuse's essay of repressive tolerance. It is part of a book entitled A Critique of Pure Tolerance that was published in 1965. It was a book by philosopher Robert Paul Wolff and psychologist or sociologist Barrington Moore and the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, in which the authors discuss the political role of tolerance. So Marcuse's contribution to this book is an essay entitled Repressive Tolerance, and this is where he also coined the term repressive tolerance in the same essay. This essay is considered the most controversial work of Marcuse since it contains a sharp critique against Western democracy and Western society at large. This essay of Marcuse was written at the height of the student protest movements in the 1960s and 70s. So in the 1960s and 70s, students at his university protested the university's involvement in the Vietnam War and the research for military devices, specifically that bombs were used to be more accurate in the bombing of the Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So Marcuse thought that this was a very important movement because it showed a protest against not only capitalism but against this type of tolerance of the intolerable. So the students so the university administrators appealed to the academic freedom to discredit the protest and defend the right for professors to contribute to the war effort. And they used Marcuse's essay to oppose that idea. So Marcuse's essay also gave students arguments against this abuse of the principle of tolerance, and Marcuse actually dedicated this essay to his students. So first of all, I'd like to say that we do have a correlation between Marcuse's background and the South African background, right? Because South African student protests is nothing new in South Africa. We've seen this happening since the 1970s and as early as the 1960s. And we had a recent revival of those student protest movements in 2016 with the Fees Must Fall movements and protests. So we can see that there is that type of correlation between the Vietnam protests and the protests in South Africa, especially how it also contributes to the political and the cultural trends within South Africa. So also what we have to remember, many took Marcuse's essay as either an attack of the ideal of free speech, especially the political right, whereas the political left saw this as a rationale for interrupting or refusing discussion and debate. But we must understand that Marcuse comes from the background of Nazi Germany, and his argument lies in the memory of the rise of Nazism under the protection of the democratic constitution of the Weimar Republic. The dire results of that was to principled commitment of free speech and to remind us that the historic struggle for tolerance has always been a partisan matter and began with the repression of regressive forces opposed to the progress of freedom. So instead of progressing freedom, it actually opposed the progress of freedom. So tolerance cannot mean equal time for Nazis and Jews, right? They cannot coexist. The ideal of tolerance presupposes social condition in which contending opinions all have fair hearing. This is not the case in advanced societies dominated by one-sided propaganda today. And it's something that we see especially in recent years with the Trump election in America, right? So what then prevails is not a rational debate and search for truth, but a manipulative persuasion in the interests of hegemony, where social forces focuses on the control of government and mass media and the falsifiability of principles of tolerance by privileging conservative voices, all others in the republic and the public sphere. So it completely marginalized and appeals to tolerance very evils, and tolerance was established to fight. So the idea that tolerance is used as in we should tolerate these conservative voices that actually repress freedom instead of demanding and perpetuating freedom is a paradox in itself. So you can see here the paradox of tolerance. This is actually Karl Popper, but it comes down to the same thing. We should not tolerate the intolerable. Okay, so in this essay, Marcuse refers specifically to John Stuart Mill's objective of liberalist or pure tolerance. Mill argues that tolerance is to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties, so adult people, not children, and that liberty as a principle has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind had become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. He continued by stating that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actual effecting that end. So Mill is basically arguing that we should free the mind to rationally pursue truth. In other words, we should have freedom of thought and we should pursue that thought rationally to find truth. However, Marcuse argues that Mill's objectives of liberalist or true tolerance is unattainable within late industrial capitalist societies. Marcuse argues that this type of tolerance that Mill is suggesting is deliberate practice of selective liberal tolerance. In other words, we have a propaganda where only certain voices and certain ideas and ideals of freedom are tolerated where others are suppressed. This selective tolerance, which places conditions on tolerance, is the opposite of free or liberal tolerance. Now, it's interesting that Marcuse says this because he actually later argues in the essay that the left the left or the more liberals in American politics should be given more voice than the right, the conservative right-leaning politics. Instead, a selective tolerance reinforces the repression of a free or liberating tolerance. So Marcuse is basically highlighting that paradox within Mill's objective of a liberalist tolerance. So following the dialectics of Hegel, Marcuse claims that although humans are rational beings that search for objective truth, he accepts this, These concepts and ideals, such as freedom and tolerance, should not be abstract, but shaped in our practical experiences that are dialectically shaped through our understanding of history. So basically, Marcuse once again goes back. This goes back to his whole definition of what critical theory is. It is a practical thing. It is a search for human happiness and a search or pursuit for human freedom and human rights, right? And he says that there should not be abstract concepts, although we do have the ability as rational beings to pursue them. It should be focused on our practical experiences because that actually shapes our day-to-day experience of the political sphere. So Marcuse also agreed with Karl Marx, who argued that domination is central to the social, moral, and political problems that we face in advanced industrial capitalist society today. And we can see that this type of domination has also been seen in things like apartheid and Nazism. So Marcuse states that a humane society of genuinely free and equal individuals living without fear and misery is history's telos. That is the goal of history, is to incite human freedom without fear or misery, and also human happiness. So Marcuse also uses or follows Sigmund Freud. Marcuse understands that in any civilized society, some suppression is necessary to avoid unnecessary harm or conflict. So we don't just give in to all our needs, desires, and thoughts. We have to suppress some of them to a limited or within some sort of limitation. We have to suppress those needs and desire in order to live harmoniously in society. So that is definitely necessary. However, Marcuse argued that post-World War II, very affluent countries have developed forms of unnecessary political, cultural, and economic domination, which he refers to as surplus repression. So this is not the repression to ensure a harmonious society and that we all live together in a civilized society, something that is necessary. We can't just act on every impulse that we have. So what he's referring to here, that after World War II, with the development of affluent countries and specifically advanced industrial capitalist countries, we experience surplus repression. So repression that is beyond what is necessary for a harmonious society. So surplus repression takes the intolerable conditions to human freedom. And a very explicit example of this is, of course, the apartheid regime in South Africa. In doing so, these affluent societies have undermined the true liberation of economic and political, as well as the liberation function of tolerance. So, although South Africa is not really considered an affluent country, we can still say that we are a post-industrialist capitalist society because we have a lot of neoliberal capitalist policies in our economic system, in the way that we function and the ideas that we have, right? Because we always associate every idea or every factor of our being with our economic condition. And the practice of a liberating tolerance was the only hope for its restoration. So the idea is that we do not want a tolerance of the intolerable, right? So we see this once again with reference to Marcuse in Nazism, but we also see this within capitalist societies and, of course, within apartheid in South Africa. The function and value of tolerance, Marcuse explains, depends on the equality prevalent in society in which tolerance is practiced. So if you have a very dominating society with legislations that restrict people's freedoms and rights, this is not tolerable, right? So it depends on the equality within society. If you have equal part in discussion and debate within politics, then that is good and that can be tolerated. But when it comes to the point where your political society or society at large is demanding a surplus repression, that should not be tolerated. So in advanced capitalist societies, we see and experience many forms of propaganda, such as advertising. I have some few examples in here as well, where something like Coca-Cola is said to be a unifying or universal type of commodity, right? We all drink Coca-Cola, we all are united in that sense. However, this creates an idea that is not very true, because we have very different experiences of society, and it's a way of promoting hegemony in society, in the political and economic sphere, and also in society at large. Moreover, these societies, the dominant social institutions, such as the monopolistic media, use new and dystopian forms of technological and mental coordination to administer what has become a totalitarian, self-perpetuating system. So we can see this again within the American context, where the media is very monopolistic and focused on polarizing the society, right? So we don't necessarily have that very dominant in South Africa, but we do still experience that, a propaganda media that informs us to unite and that we're all the same and that we all drink Coke, we all drive Fords, we all do this, when this is not really the true practical experience of everyday life for people. And this becomes a way of dominating a totalitarian, self-perpetuating system. So the more people believe in it and the more they develop this false consciousness in society, the bigger the system gets and the more ingrained and indoctrinated people become. Now we can see this especially in South Africa during the apartheid regime, right? So media during apartheid was censored, highly censored, highly controlled, and it portrayed a certain propaganda of apartheid system being good, being to the benefit of all, when the experience of people in South Africa was very different. And it becomes totalitarian in the form of it becoming dominating. It's dominating political, social, cultural, and economic forces or economic forms, right? And this is also self-perpetuating, because the more that we are exposed to this type of propaganda, the more people actually become indoctrinated and perpetuate these ideas. So Marcuse believes that the media wrongly pays as much attention to the non-news as to the real news. And I think we can all see this with the fake news type of trends that we see today in the media. This kind of tolerance of irrelevant news was considered repressive by Marcuse, because it diminishes the relative importance of the real news. So this is how Marcuse is basically defining the propaganda, or explaining what the harmful effects of these type of propaganda is. So, like I said, we see this in the trends of fake news that we experience in today's society still. In these societies where economic and political progress is subjected to an ubiquitous and effective administration in accordance with the predominant interests, individuals have been systematically devised of their own capacity to think as rational, autonomous individuals. So what Marcuse is saying here is that there are literally economic, political, and cultural institutions, legislations, policies set in place that are basically effectively restoring and perpetuating that force of control. And we see this especially in political and economic forms, right? With, for example, political or economic policies in South Africa. So this is also not in the interests of the majority of South Africans. This is in the predominant interests of the rich and the wealthy, the powerful, to keep themselves in power. And they do this with this propaganda and with this dominating false consciousness that is perpetuated in society. And individuals have that systematic capacity to think is diminished because they are exposed to this monopolizing media, this propaganda, to such an extent that they do not think rationally, autonomously. They are thinking in accordance to the predominant social, political, and economic policies, legislation, propaganda that they see every day and that has become ingrained within their everyday experience. So people within these societies have developed what Marcuse refers to as a false consciousness. This is also something that Marcuse gets from Karl Marx. It is this false consciousness that limits or even destroys a person's ability to pursue truth through the free exercise of their individual reason, and in turn to create a just and humane society. So basically what happens here is because we develop this false consciousness, because we are exposed to so much propaganda, and because that propaganda is trying to perpetuate and ingrain in a totalitarian state, we see that this free exercise of individual reason and your your freedom and your rights are actually diminished and limited. And this is in opposition to creating a just, humane, and equal society. In a democracy with a totalitarian organization, the administration is so dominant that it comes to construct consciousness itself. Now, once again, we can see this especially in South Africa during apartheid, where consciousness and the way that people thought was very dominated. It constructed a certain type of thought, consciousness, experience, and living. Far from serving as a neutral medium for rational reflection, the language, its very concepts and categories, is transformed into a neutralizing instrument of repression. So I immediately think of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's cultural bomb here, right? And he also refers to how language is a form of domination and how this creates a repression and basically a disruption of an entire culture, of an entire society, essentially. Now, through the operation of language, mental attitudes are formed that tend to obliterate the difference between true and false, information and indoctrination, right and wrong. Because of the language that these propaganda and media use to indoctrinate us, we see that it creates a type of attitude that is formed, ingrained, and indoctrinated within society. And this can be to inform what is right and wrong, true and false. Just the term apartheid can evoke an idea of how of a system of how society should function and what is wrong, what is right, and what is true and what is false. So people are indoctrinated by the conditions under which they live and think and which they do not transcend. So it's a very popular theory within critical theory that we are kept busy with economic means of and consumerist pursuits in order for society and people in society to have that repression and domination and to perpetuate that false consciousness. And this is specifically so that people in power and power positions can maintain their wealth and power and actually perpetuate and establish that and ingrain that power more. So while the working class is busy pursuing the consumerist needs, and in order to pursue their consumerist needs, they need to labor. This working class is kept busy with their consumerist needs, with their labor, and they're not thinking about the repression, and they're not actually thinking about liberation. Their opulence is incorporated into a system which fosters tolerance as a means of perpetuating the struggle for existence and suppressing alternatives, in significant part by testifying to the existence of democratic liberties. So we can see that the RDP and gear economic policies after apartheid is a great example of this. So post-apartheid, or just before apartheid ended, we heard about the Berlin Wall falling, about the Soviet society falling, and all these ideas of what we had about a communist society basically ended because there was no option beside capitalism and neoliberal capitalism specifically. So our economic policies in that short time frame drastically shifted from a very Marxist, very radical type of economic policies of radical redistribution to the redistribution development program, which was more Keynesian. Not it's more Keynesian in the sense that it took on the Keynesian principles of America right after World War II that was focused on social and economic development going hand in hand. And we can see that this was a success in America, and therefore this was a great opportunity for South Africa to establish that type of Keynesian policies after apartheid. However, we see that instead, GEAR, the Growth, Economic, and Redistribution Program, was very neoliberal. And this is actually the economic policies that focused on economic development, GDPs, and all these type of abstract remuneration and abstract economic growth. And while it did bring about economic growth, it also escalated economic inequality because what happened was the wealthy got wealthier and the poor got poorer. And instead of focusing on social development, post-apartheid South Africa focused on economic policies because they thought once economic policies and economic growth was established, then the social development would go hand in hand, right? It would just automatically follow. But if you do not focus on social development, it will not develop, right? So it's not necessarily true that these two things follow each other. So, and this came to the great expense of the majority of South Africans that were the most vulnerable in South African society. And this actually perpetuated and escalated economic inequality in South Africa. Advanced capitalist societies are perpetuating false consciousness, the marketplace of ideas. So basically, what they want to perpetuate and ingrain in us is to think of ourselves in every facet of our beings as being economic beings or economic vessels. So instead of thinking about what my passion is and what I want to continue to in my studies at university or tertiary education, I'm focusing rather on what would get me a job and what would make me the most money, right? And we even have that type of cost benefit analysis in our everyday experience, right? We're not thinking about what would make us more liberated, more free, what would advance our emotional well-being, our happiness, or overall well-being. We are constantly measuring our understanding of everyday existence according to this cost-benefit analysis. And this creates a mass consciousness. This is not something that is just experienced by one person. It is a mass false consciousness that develops, turning individuals away from radical possibilities and reconciling them to the status quo. And we can see this again. Instead of implementing a radical new type of economic policies, and we don't know if this would have been positive or negative, or what type of consequences it would have had, but we don't. But that wasn't even an option, right? The global marketplace and other foreign countries and other institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, they basically said South Africa post-apartheid has to be neoliberal capitalist society. There is no alternative. And this has created and perpetuated economic inequality in South Africa because the element of social development was neglected. While the toleration of apparent dissonance is celebrated, truly effective dissonance becomes impossible. So it's like trying to swim upstream, right? It is very difficult to oppose such an overall holistic system as an individual. It has to be a radical subjective consciousness that we as a society should um, pursue. So, under these historical conditions, the purportedly neutral liberalist tolerance becomes repressive. So, this goes back to Mills's idea that tolerance, um, or the objective of tolerance, is that it should pursue a rational freedom, right? A liberal tolerance. But this doesn't actually happen, right? If you're selective in what can be tolerated. Mostly the voices of a more liberalist or less conventional in the political sphere, those voices are repressed. Um, and instead, the platform is given to a more conservative political agenda. And although we don't have that black and white or that specific right, left, conservative, liberalist type of um, um, political sphere in South Africa, we still have the consequences of it, and we still experience the consequences of it because we are adhering to this global market economic system, right? So, to weigh truth and falsity rationally and accurately, to express ourselves as the rational and atomic beings that Mo envisioned, individuals need to be freed from the prevailing indoctrination. So, Marcuse is seeking for a radical revolution within people's consciousness. So, the efforts to counteract this dehumanization, Marx explained, must begin at the place of entrance, where the false consciousness takes form, or rather is systematically formed. It just begins with stopping the words and the images which feed this consciousness, right? And we can see this again: open Coke, open happiness. If you buy Coke, you'll be happy, and everyone buys Coke. So if it creates this idea that in order to be happy, you have to consume things, you have to adhere to this market forces, which is not true. True happiness has nothing to do with commodities. It does help, but it isn't the be all and end all of happiness. To be liberated, individuals would have to get informed, slanted, and the opposite direction. So Marcuse is once again using the dialectics of Hegel and saying that we must have a radical sway in the way that we think and approach life, right? So the withdrawal of tolerance would have to be aimed at ideas, groups, movements, which promote aggressive policies, armament, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, or which oppose the extension of public services, social security, medical care, and etc. So these are the things that we should pursue. We shouldn't pursue aggressive policies that just promote chauvinism, racism, and etc. Right? So Marcuse's call for the restoration of freedom through the practice of liberating tolerance raised the question of who is to decide on the distinction between liberating and repressive, human and inhuman teachers and practices. So basically, the question comes up, okay, who decides what is intolerable? Who decides whether what should be allowed in a political debate? So rejecting relativism, he maintained that these decisions can be made rationally on empirical grounds by everyone who has learned to think rationally and autonomously. Who would these clear-sighted leaders be, and how many could we expect to find? Where society has entered the phase of total administration and indoctrination, he noted, this would be a small number indeed. So there's only a small number of people who are radically freed from this indoctrination and this false consciousness on a massive societal scale. In this essay, Marcuse argues that capitalism and democracy is totalitarian and repressive systems. So he's not saying that democracy is wrong, right? We all want democracy, but he says that the policies within democratic societies and within capitalist democratic societies is totalitarian because it gives and perpetuates the power and to people already in positions of power and wealth. So one form of repressive tolerance Marcuse mentions is tolerating, under the guise of neutrality of freedom of expression, opinions that are regressive, recessive, and objectively incorrect. So instead of, we shouldn't tolerate or allow these expressions to exist because they are regressive and they are oppressive, right? So, and they come under the guise of freedom of expression or freedom of speech, where actually it is perpetuating the idea of dominance, and it is always skewed towards people already in power. So Marcuse specifically and ironically and maybe paradoxically said that we should not give people with these repressive ideas the platform. As well-informed progressive left-wingers do not promote tolerance according to Marcuse, but only to the status quo, which leaves the ruling power structures untouched. So Marcuse would give more political sway and political stages to the left-leaning, to the more liberating side than to the conservative, because he says that those ideals within liberalism in American politics would essentially promote equality because it is ingrained and it is part of their ideals, their ideas, and their values. So Marcuse concludes that therefore undemocratic means, such as certain forms of direct action, can promote tolerance and break through repressive tolerance. So Marcuse did say that there has never been a revolution without some type of violence. And although he doesn't necessarily say that it is necessary, he has not experienced it, a revolution without violent means. So luckily in South Africa, the transition of power from apartheid to the post-apartheid government was peaceful, but we can still see this underlying violent trends within society, right? So repressive tolerance therefore has two main forms: the unthinking acceptance of entrenched attitudes and ideas, accepting things and propaganda without thinking about it, essentially, even when these obviously damaging to other people. So this is very important, that those propagandas and those attitudes and ideas are repressing people's freedom, and it's a surplus repression. It is beyond what is necessary for a harmonious society, or indeed the environment. The painfully slow response to warnings about climate change, the environmental degradation might be seen as an example of this. And we can see in South Africa that we're not giving enough stage and enough attention to drastic climate change. Secondly, the vocal endorsement of actions that are manifestly aggressive towards other people. Once again, this is not passive or unthinking acceptance. This is the vocal endorsement of actions that basically perpetuate and ingrain and encourage ideas that are damaging to people's well-being. So genuine tolerance, Marcuse argues, can only exist in a situation of intolerance for the limits on real freedom. So this is how we distinguish between what can be tolerated and what should not be tolerated, right? If these political, economical, cultural trends or ideas, attitudes, and ideals are actually progressing repression, and it's beyond what is necessary for a harmonious society, and it's actually hurting or limiting people's freedom and happiness and well-being, this is something that should not be tolerated. So Marcuse was often pessimistic about the prospects of a widespread liberation from the false consciousness that has become the general or mass consciousness. Repressive tolerance is then not real tolerance, but a strategy to combat ideas that are not tolerated. But in repressive tolerance, he appealed hopefully to ingrained intellectuals whose task and duty is to recall repressive historical possibilities which seem to have become utopian possibilities, and to break the concreteness of impression in order to open the mental space in which society can be reorganized as what it is and does. And here, South Africa is once again a great example of people actually taking power into their own hands and breaking this concrete oppression and false mass consciousness. Marcuse insisted that, unlike in the spheres of business, advertising, and the broader culture, the trend in education enterprise could conceivably be enforced by the students and the teachers themselves, and thus be self-imposed. So Marcuse was a very great supporter of education as a means of liberation. And he saw it as students and as teachers' duties to establish, encourage, and promote this type of breaking of the false mass consciousness. Unless the student learns to think in the opposite direction, Marcuse insisted, he will be inclined to place facts into the predominant framework of values. So he has to be taught to think in the opposite direction, the student. So the student has to be exposed to alternative means. Remember, the point of surplus repression is that there is no real alternative provided, or it is presented as if there is no alternative to the society that is established today. So what Marcuse wants in education, higher education, is for people to get or be exposed to alternative thoughts and ideas. It's under these historical conditions, all genuine education is counter-education. So it's counter to the culture that is established. So Marcuse's call for liberating tolerance was adopted enthusiastically by the radical student movements of the late 1960s in both Europe and the United States, as we discussed, and was practically influential on the American New Left. That's why he's called or often referred to as the father of the New Left movement. His argument that a vanguard of students, teachers, and intellectuals had a special role to play, especially within educational institutions, in the breaking of concreteness of oppression by suppressing ideas and actions and language, objectively determined aggressive and inhumane, with both the objective of freeing students from the prevailing indoctrination and reestablishing the conditions of equality conducive to true freedom. In South Africa, we can see Steve Biko and his development of the Black consciousness movement during his student years as a great example of breaking of that repressive and mass indoctrination and mass false consciousness. And the way that he said to take authority, to take possession of your own consciousness and establish what values and ideals are important to you and in the Black community. So as liberalism and leftism made common cause within historical Kruger Bill of the late 1960s and late 1970s, the Marcusean approach to tolerance insinuated itself, if not always self-evidently in theory, the more transparently in practice, into even the ostensibly mainstream or pure liberal thinking, the thought of liberals accepted, as well as into governing rules and practices of institutions such as universities under liberal left control. Whether this marks a departure from liberal principles or, as Marcuse maintained, a return to liberals' traditional historical function is a question of considerable interest and complexity. So some concluding remarks. So basically, repressive tolerance comes down to the idea that there is a hegemony and that there is a surplus repression taking place in society. And we can see this in South African history and something that is still experienced to this day. And what we have to understand is that our experience of society is not homogeneous, it's not the same. There is wide inequality in education, healthcare, and basic service delivery, and we can see this in inequality and unemployment rising and rising and rising. The more that we give economic development space and to grow, the more that we think about economic development as our only means to happiness and general well-being as individuals and as a society, the more we're going to see these social economic inequalities rise. Because if we don't give attention to the social development of South Africa in the form of basic education, healthcare, service delivery, employment, then there will not be great change in South Africa. And we need to oppose these ideas that implement a surplus repression that perpetuates a false consciousness in society, something that started long ago and is still perpetuated in South Africa today. Okay, thank you all for listening. This is the end of my presentation. I would love to hear some questions or some comments or ideas on on my lecture.
Thank you, Danelle. I really appreciate it. Just two quick things before I open up, because I think that this presentation that speaks to Godfrey's work on church and state theology. I can also see Jules Pesci and her work with teachers being very interested in this, along with plenty of other people like Terry and her work in peace studies as well. But two things to spring to mind, and I'm not sure if it was intentional on your point, but Margaret Thatcher, who along with Ronald Reagan were the great evangelists of neoliberalism, if you will, her favorite phrase was, "There is no alternative." And so
Yeah.
I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it does remind me of that. But also an interesting anecdote about Herbert Marcuse that Danelle would often tell me is that at this point in time, he's in his 60s, I believe. Playboy
Right.
magazine comes and asks him to do an interview. And he says that he would only do the interview if he was allowed to have his own nude pictorial set right beside the centerfolds and so forth. So he was quite the feminist as well. It was kind of interesting.
Yes, no, he was. He also worked for the CIA at one stage. So he's a very interesting person with a very interesting life that he led. Very controversial, very radical in his thought and development, but I think it is needed in society. But yes, you can also see that sort of thought of freedom and liberation being very important to Marcuse in his refusal to do an interview with Playboy magazine, because he thought of like the repression of women and how women were pictured in society, and he thought that this was a false or also a form of domination. So that's very interesting, yes.
So I'll open the floor to questions. You can either turn on your mic and if you'd like, and also if you have the data, your camera, or you can just raise your hand. Okay, Yaku, start us off, please.
Justin, yes, I have a question, but perhaps just want to know if they are not one of the other students, really. Okay, let me see. I don't see any other hands yet, so let me start off. Danelle, thank you very much. Yeah, I really enjoyed this overview, and specifically that reading of that article by Marcuse, that chapter there. Very, very interesting. Thank you. So I want to make an observation and then end with a question to you. All right. So firstly, just a kind of an observation. I think for me, at least, the critical theories analysis of society is very much spot on. I like it, and I find myself very much attracted to that critical theories analysis of liberalism at the moment as and maybe he didn't use the word hegemonic, but I think one can speak of a kind of a liberal worldview that's very much hegemonic at the moment and it's being projected across the world. And one can really see somehow the intolerance of the liberal worldview that's being projected across the world. Also in the geopolitical situation at the moment, where the war in Ukraine is sort of very much through the news and everything projected as being Russian aggression, which of course it is, but there's very much a kind of a worldview being defended and pushed by the NATO kind of liberal powers as well. So definitely that is the case, and as soon as one understands that liberalism is it's not a kind of a neutral thing, but it's very much a specific worldview that's being pushed, then I think this critical theoretical analysis becomes apparent. But the question then is whether the the solution sort of, or the remedy that Marcuse and maybe someone like Jürgen Habermas presents is feasible, just so that we must become more rational. We must educate people that we have more rational debate. I'm not so sure about that it could actually work. He was himself also, as you mentioned, quite skeptical whether it could really work, but at least he said we had to try. My thought at the moment is that what's going to happen if, say the new liberal worldview is collapsing somehow or is being pushed back, this hegemony is being pushed back. What is the alternative? And as you also mentioned, it seems like it's the swing is towards the right at the moment, with Trump and Brexit and what's that new party in Italy now that came to power, and so on, and Hungary. So the new fascism is coming up, and there's the swing to the right. I'm wondering, what would a post-liberal left alternative be? I can't find myself with a kind of a swing to the right. I despise fascism. So what would be some alternative on the other side of this liberalism look like that would be on the left side of the political spectrum? And together with that, just my question to you then, is critical theory really left? Is it not very mainstream still, with its very much rational kind of all rational debate? So is it really an alternative to the left, at least in today's world? I know people are saying one should not confuse liberalism with being left. I think the kind of liberalism that we see at the moment is very conservative because it wants to maintain the hegemony of a new liberal capitalist world.
Right, so you're correct that you need to distinguish between political liberalism and liberalism in sense of like its economic form. So liberalism in its economic form comes from Adam Smith and basically the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. So they are perpetuating the idea of perpetual economic growth, self-regulating economic mechanism, all these things that we see in neoliberal capitalism today. And this is very different from political liberalism that we see in the political parties of like in America, the conservatives versus liberalists, right? So liberalists in a political sphere that we see is for women's rights, for the conservation of the environment, and for the progression of human rights and all these things. And so is there an alternative? What is the solution? I don't think there is necessarily a solution that you can point to necessarily. Marcuse himself says that we should focus on a a radical subjectivism. In other words, becoming radically aware of our subjective consciousness, right? And this is very informed through our experiences and understanding of the world. And he did suggest that education is the way to go forward, but even our education systems today are very much more business orientated. We, as Achille Mbembe himself said, we treat students like clients or like consumers. They're not thinking of them as students. And the whole purpose of university has shifted from being an institution where people can actually learn and contribute to society to skills development for a specific purpose or for a specific job. So I don't think that education is necessarily, not in the form that we experience it today and not in the way that it's developing today, is the answer. But I do think, and I do agree with Marcuse, that becoming radically subjectively aware of our own consciousness and trying to find our own way and trying to sort of swim upstream, no matter if it is to no avail, that is what we should do, because if enough people do it, we can stop the stream. Basically, we can create a barrier for this trends. But what it specifically points to, like, can I give you a specific solution? No, there's no specific solution. This is something that has to develop within society, develop within the historical consciousness, and develop within the historical dialectic. So that is where the answer will come from. It will not be something that we can point to today, I think. But if you want a practical answer from me, I think that something like the RDP policies that we had, or that we wanted to implement post-apartheid, or that the South African government wanted to implement post-apartheid, that is basically based off of the Keynesian system and the New Deal. I think that that is a viable solution for South Africa, because it focuses not only on social development, but social development being primary, and then economic development being secondary, and that will follow. Whereas new liberal policies focus on the economic development, and the social development never happens. So that is my, I hope that was a satisfactory answer, Yaku.
Thank you, Danelle. Thank you.
Okay.
So who would like to ask the next question? Because I'm going to pick on somebody if not. Because Terry, please go right ahead. And I understand that you have some networking issues, so if you can't turn on your camera, that's fine. Oh, hello, Terry. You're still on mute, though. You're still on mute. You're still on mute. You're still on mute.
Oh, here we go. All right.
There
Sorry
we go.
about that. Sorry, Danielle. I'm lying down because I've got a sore arm. But I just wanted to say I was fascinated by your presentation, and it was very illuminating. I'm wondering, how would Marcuse have positioned social movement, not and the social agency that people have in society? How would we approach this? Because as I understand your presentation, you were talking about a change of consciousness. So is there a link between changing consciousness and then social agency within the collective?
Right. So Marcuse basically said that in order for change to happen on a societal level, it must first be lived, experienced, and basically felt on a very individual, conscious experience of the world. So it is in our subjectives, so our individual radical subjectivism, our radical understanding of our subjective consciousness that can create an intersubjective consciousness, right? So it is through our collective understandings of individuals that we form movements, social movements. And we can oppose this this great false mass consciousness by a radical understanding of our own. And this once again he suggested doing through education. And once again, I want to bring up the example of Steve Biko. He actually broke through that mass false consciousness and tried to establish a Black conscious movement by saying, like, let us become radically aware of our own individual and cultural ideals, ideas, values, and characteristics, and take that into our own hands and understand it through our own eyes instead of the predominant cultural trends or propaganda that we see and that we live and experience. And I think this is a great example of what Marcuse actually wants to happen in society. He wants that really defined breakthrough through the propaganda, through the mass false consciousness. And this happens on an individual level, but we see once one individual, it takes one person to put a new thought or a new seed in your mind, and that will grow into some bigger movements. And once again, we can see this with the Black consciousness movement. And I think Marcuse, like he did with the student protest movements in the 1960s and 70s, he actually was a great supporter of that. He thought it was a great movement against the established society and established norms and ideals that was so repressive and so dominating in society and causing so much harm. So I think that Marcuse would definitely be a supporter of any type of radical movement that goes against this conservative propaganda that is repressing people's freedoms, repressing people's liberties and understandings and their movements.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so any other questions? Godfrey, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick on you just a little bit because we just finished your mini dissertation. So, does the presentation that Danelle had, for me, whenever I'm thinking about your work, I can see a direct correlation with what was going on with church theology and state theology as the Kairos documents articulated. Could you make that connection for us? If not, we can make it together.
Yes, I in the case of state theology, there was a consciousness that developed over a period of time, basically amongst the Afrikaner people, where they have this they developed this self-awareness or self-belief that they were special people and that they carried a special mandate in terms of which they were to civilize the rest of the African society. Now, well, and that persisted for a long time. As late as 1989, P.W. Botha was quoted as expressing the same sentiments at Stellenbosch. So it is something that persisted for a very long time. But now, like what he said about Marcuse's criticism of society, especially the Western society and its thought, it is intolerant of self-introspection and self-examination. So those kind of ideologies, if I may use the word ideology to define them, they do not accept, or they did not accept criticism, especially from inside, that they're not self-critical. And then I think that's the solution, some form of critical activism that comes from within. And that's what Karl Marx argued, that unless we develop a self-critical approach to whatever ideology that we hold, whether it's even Christianity or a religion or neoliberalism or whatever, it eventually will come to that. So I think that is inherent in any ideology that is not self-critical, like apartheid was. So I think that's what she was defining.
Yeah, that's very good. A very good analysis. I agree, and I can see a lot of similarities in the fact that there was these dominating ideas within the South African Calvinist churches that perpetuated these ideas, and it took a breaking of that consciousness or a development of self-criticism, or just being exposed to alternatives that ultimately led to the breaking of it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And this may not necessarily only be in Western liberalism. I think also in Eastern ideologies, it happens when they are not self-critical and when they do not develop that consciousness. That every ideology, if it's left alone or it does not accept examination from outside or from within, it will definitely lead to that. That's how I understand it.
Yes, no, I think that's correct. I also agree with you.
Sister Judy.
I was just going to say an example might be Bears Naudet, his own, from the perspective of religion, his own real coming to critique not only the society, his own tradition, his own religious tradition, and of course the society in which that tradition lived, just as another example of that awareness, consciousness.
Yeah, that's very good. We're currently talking about different research projects and ideas that Bears Naudet came up, and so yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. So any other final questions? Danelle, do you have any concluding remarks?
Just thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for engaging with the work and for the very insightful questions. I hope that I did not disappoint and that I lived up to everyone's expectations and that I answered all the questions to your satisfaction. You can also email me, Danelle Fourie at nwu.ac.za. If you have any questions or any comments or discussions that you want to continue.
Yeah, and you can also email her for the text as well, because I think we're a PDF family, so we have all the PDFs.
Yes, that's very true.
On behalf of St. Augustine's College, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It's a great way for us to end the symposium year, and I really wish that our neighbor's dog would stop barking.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity.
I'm going to end the recording now and start up a new recording so that we have two separate videos to upload, okay? So this will take just a second. In the meantime, Yaku, if you would get ready to introduce Jonathan Smith,